read. I've so enjoyed it. It's the evolving of a human from a child to an adult. It's often said to involve storm and stress, but you pour cold water on that notion and reassure us that the evidence shows us that young people, like our own teens, are capable of curiosity, creativity, and feeling deeply. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Okay, thank you very much. So I started with the idea that I wanted to know what the evidence actually says, as opposed to taking a philosophical or ideological approach to teenage development and parenting, which I think is sometimes quite common, particularly in books. So people build up an expertise, but they perhaps are limited in what they see. If they're psychotherapists, for example, they're limited by their particular practice, and they might then not necessarily see what's coming out from family systems experts or biologists or geneticists, or kind of understand the research in the round. So that's what I wanted to do. And then just I've kind of gone through the research and then structured the book according to relationships, connections, including friendships, romantic relationships, the online world. I look at mood and maturity, I look at mental health, I look at risk, and then kind of how you build and equip a future adult as they move through into kind of the early adult years and probably out of your immediate care and environment.
Yeah, although they don't ever completely lose the need for parents, do they? It's
no, I'm not at that stage yet, but I'm assuming not.
It's a nice feeling, actually, in some cases.
Yeah.
Now you say that the storm and stress theory, that's old hat now. And you give us a wealth of research that shows there are all these different ways of looking at things.
So the storm and stress model was developed quite early in adolescent development literature, and it's this idea that teenagers are marked by kind of temper tantrums and tempestuousness and rows with their parents, and it's this kind of ongoing really difficult period for parents. And actually the research doesn't bear this up. Of course there are going to be rows in some circumstances. Teenagers will go through tricky periods, they'll have mood challenges, but not all teenagers go through that particular way of being, and that's certainly not all the time. So it really varies. And there's also some research that suggests that your expectations help create reality. So if you're expecting storm and stress, that's probably what you're going to get. Whereas if you go into each new interaction, even if the last one's been quite challenging, if you go into each new one with a kind of positive outlook and an idea that you're starting a conversation from scratch, and it's all going to be, you'll have a lovely conversation about what they're going to be doing that day or whatever it is, that actually that's the way that you kind of build those connections, and then you create the reality that actually you have the connection with your teenager and you build your relationship going forward, rather than constantly kind of getting at each other or bickering or whatever it is that you would be expecting if you had a slightly more kind of negative expectation of what was going to happen.
That can work.
Yes, and I mean, anecdotally, I've done quite a lot of trial and error with some of the research findings, and for me, it works very, very well. If I'm expecting, if I'm expecting rows and difficult behaviour, then that's what I get. And if I'm more optimistic, then it generally tends to go better.
I like that you don't pretend to know it all, and you don't pretend to be perfect, which is great. Sometimes I don't know if you ever saw Dr. Spock or any of those other old ones that were current when I was having children, and it was a counsel of perfection all the time. And you give us a way out, really, of not expecting that we have to be perfect, so we can give our youngsters the freedom not to be perfect themselves.
Yes, so you are modelling imperfection for your teenagers, so that they understand
exactly
that they don't have to live up to impossible standards. Yes. Yeah, no, I'm highly imperfect as a parent, but that's probably to my children's benefit.
I think so. Yeah, we're doing them a service.
Yes,
exactly. It's a bit like, in the Turkish rug, where they're supposed to, you hear that the weavers put in an error in the pattern because only Allah can be perfect. That's what we're doing.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah. Now, early on, you give us a little idea of what we're trying to aim for with children, and you give us this model of authoritative parenting rather than authoritarian or permissive or in different styles. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's a nice little
yeah, so it's basically a model
display.
of how whether you have boundaries or the extent to which you have boundaries, and then how warm and supportive you are with teenagers, and what tends to come out across studies, no matter what outcome you're looking at, whether that's physical health, mental health, resilience, connections with friends, or at the extent to which teenagers take dangerous risks. Authoritative parenting seems to be the model to which we are aiming. So that is where you have a kind of good level of structure. So you have lots of boundaries, and you also provide them with huge warmth and support. So you kind of set some high expectations, but also you help them to meet those expectations. You don't just leave them kind of swimming on their own to try and get there, but you're really there providing whatever help you can in the background, at the same time as kind of clarifying that you expect, I don't know, that they will be home from the party at 11 o'clock, or that they will not drink alcohol when they get there, or whatever it may be, that you are kind of you putting some rules in place and not letting them kind of dictate exactly how your relationship works with each other.
Because we're the parent, not them. We're the parent.
Exactly, and the authority, no matter how it might feel in the moment, the authority rests with us, and they need to feel that the authority rests with us as well, in a way that helps them to feel safe. Because if everything is set by them, then anything can happen, chaos can result. Whereas if we've got there was an analogy that I cited that child development specialists had come up with in my first book, which was about driving over a bridge at night. And if you've got railings around the bridge, then you can go over it quite quickly. And if there are no railings and there's no light, then you could easily fall off the edge. So actually having those kind of edges and in the form of boundaries in place can be really, is really helpful for most teenagers.
And from those boundaries and those limits, and in fact, I used to tell my girls that, you know, if I said that they couldn't do this, they could blame me. Whereas if they didn't want to do this, that, the other, that was on them, and they might find it easier to blame the old fogies for not being able to do something they didn't want to do. That went down quite well, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
And that's a kind of scaffolding thing. So you're helping them to navigate a difficult situation in a way that they feel in control.
And from those limits and the warmth and the guidance that you're giving to your teenagers, you're hoping to develop with this authoritative style, responsible, self-assured, and competent adults by the end of the process. That's the plan.
Well, I mean, ideally. You can never plan for it perfectly or control all outcomes. But it seems to be that if you have authoritarian parenting is where you have those tight boundaries and rules, but you lack the warmth and support, and permissive parenting is where you don't have either. So basically the teenager dictates all of the terms, and both of those styles have been associated with much worse teenage outcomes than authoritative parenting. And the worst style of all is where you have permissive parenting is where you don't have the boundaries, but you do have high warmth. And then the worst outcomes of all are basically neglectful parenting, where you don't have any boundaries and you don't have any warmth. So you don't have parents that are kind of involved properly in their teenagers' lives.
The really great thing is that all of this is backed up, everywhere. There's notes. You don't have to read them at the time, but they're there. You can refer to them. And if you need to, and sometimes they're web links as well that you give us. And if you need to, you can go and visit those and sort of check out for yourself exactly what's being said. So, it's great to have all those references. Now then, fostering autonomy is helped by forgetting at least 50% of the things to remind our youngsters for school, as that was your response, wasn't it?
Yes.
You question a 2019 handbook for parents, quoting older research about decision making, and that ignores more recent research forewarning of future difficulties for children of, I'd call them helicopter parents, parents that cosset the children in a way, so they don't have the opportunity to develop that resilience.
Yeah, there's another, so helicopter parenting is this idea that you're hovering over your teenagers or younger children. There's also somebody's brought up the idea of lawnmower parents who mow any difficulties, long weeds out of the way for their children, so that they have these kind of perfect paths, untrammeled paths to walk down. And actually that links to resilience. So looking at the research on resilience, it seems to be that teenagers need to experience a healthy level of stress in order to be able to feel that they can then handle difficult situations themselves in future. And if they haven't had those experiences to manage tricky situations for themselves because their parents have cleared their paths, then they're much less likely to be resilient over the medium to long term. So it does seem to be that kind of helicoptering or lawn mowing are probably going to be less than helpful for a lot of teenagers.
Yeah, and that makes sense, doesn't it? You can see how that would fit into reality, wouldn't you? Yeah. You encourage us to strive not to be perfect parents. So we're going for the good enough parenting, the rules, the warmth, and the involvement, turning up and going to see them perform.
Yeah, and recognizing that actually making mistakes isn't the end of the world. It's absolutely fine to make mistakes, and you can kind of front up to them as well and say, actually, I got that one wrong, and that can go down quite well.
Yeah, and that's sort of honesty, isn't it? That you need to be able to be honest about things, and give them, as we said before, the opportunity to realise that there's a way back. If you fall down, you can reschedule or find a different path.
Yes.
Now, mental health is a preoccupation nowadays, and you say that we need to talk less about mental health. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where that's come from?
Yeah, of course. So there's theory, and then there's research and evidence that backs up this theory. So the theory has been developed by some doctors at the academics at the University of Oxford, Dr. Lucy Folks and Dr. Jack Andrews, and they've developed something called the prevalence inflation hypothesis. And this is the idea that if you are a teenager and you become aware of mental health to an extent, to an unhealthy degree, for some teenagers that will lead them to introspect and to ruminate. And if they're going into their heads, they're checking themselves for symptoms because they have suddenly thought, okay, well, I've got a symptom of anxiety, so maybe I've got others. They start to check themselves. It can almost start to create the conditions that the mental health awareness campaigns are set out to help prevent. And there's quite a lot of research that backs this up. And actually, there was a study that got published today by the Department for Education, and that was looking at 12,000 teenagers. And it was 2 mental health interventions in schools, and they discovered that in the intervention arm, the teenagers had worse socio-emotional outcomes at kind of 9 to 12 months than those in the trial arms. And that backs up not all mental health interventions in schools, but there are quite a few. There's an increasing evidence base of studies showing that mental health interventions in school, the treatment arm ends up having worse outcomes than the kids that didn't have any mental health intervention. And then there's other research that kind of backs this up in other areas. So, for example, ruminating is linked to the later development of depression. So there's quite a lot to suggest that maybe we've gone slightly too far, and it's obviously not good to never to talk about mental health or never to talk about feelings. But it may be that we have gone too far in the other direction and we're now talking about it too much. And obviously teenagers aren't just exposed to it through school, they're also exposed to it online. You get lots of generic symptom lists on social media that will say, oh, do you have anxiety? Here are the top 10 signs. And quite often they'll wrap in parts of the normal human experience. So teenagers are like the rest of us, will go through periods where they feel very unhappy or very stressed, but because they don't have the life experience to recognize that these are entirely normal, they might take them as signals that there's something wrong, particularly when they've got this kind of deep fluency in being able to talk about mental health. So it's then our job to try and help them to realise that feelings pass, that they don't need to wrap them into a sense of identity, and that it's part of the human experience to feel worried about exams, or to have periods where we don't sleep particularly well, or to feel sad because a relationship's ended, or because we're having difficulties with our friends. So I think we've just got to be slightly more careful than we have done in the past, and that probably means being if you are a parent, being aware about what's happening in your children's schools in terms of mental health interventions, because I think it has this emerging body of research hasn't necessarily always filtered down yet into practice within schools. I think there's just, because it feels so intuitive that it's the right thing to do to talk about mental health, and because research takes quite a long time to get then translated back down, I'm not sure we're quite there yet.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And I suppose, having come through a period, well, most of history, when nobody talked about the feelings, and were, especially in Britain, buttoned up quite tightly, it has been welcome to ease that restriction, if you like, so that repressedness, so that we're a bit more able to talk about our feelings. But what you're saying is the pendulum swung a bit too far. And
and I'm not suggesting that we go back to being entirely repressed, never talking about anything, but I think there is a balance, and we are probably too far to one side of it at the moment.
Okay, so there needs to be a bit of a course correction there.
And I think the other thing actually that I'd say just about mental health awareness is about labels. So I think it's very easy, if you're aware as a teenager of conditions like anxiety or depression or other mental health conditions, it's very easy to hook onto a label, particularly at a time where you're searching for an identity. And it's one of the main tasks of adolescence, is to kind of try on different identities, to work out what fits you, to work out what you want to take on going forward. And actually, once you've developed, once you've kind of taken on a label of having a mental health condition, it becomes very hard to shake it off. And there's research suggesting that if you take on a label of that nature, it can then affect your self-esteem. And if you drop the label, your self-esteem will go back up again. And once you have it, it's quite hard to row back on. So I think helping teenagers to, if they start to say, I have anxiety, maybe try and move them to slightly lighter, more careful language, like, oh, you're feeling worried at the moment. Not kind of not saying, oh no, you're wrong, you don't have anxiety, but just kind of trying to reframe the language that's being used so that it's easier to shake it off and recognize that it's a passing state and that they have control over it. Because also the moment it's part of your identity, then you lose a sense of control that you can actually then do something about it and move past it.
So they've got legitimate anxiety about a specific problem, or I don't know, a music exam that's coming up, or a race they're running in, and that will pass when that's over.
And it's normal to feel worried and sad sometimes when there's no reason for it as well, and kind of helping them to recognize that. Sometimes we feel worried and sad because we're humans and that happens, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a kind of everlasting part of our identity. We will likely move past it.
I've got a question from Una Jane here. I will just ask this while we're in the middle of this topic. Can I ask about sleeplessness? She says, do anxieties in teenagers become far too serious? So do they contribute? So do the anxieties that teenagers have become far too serious? Does that lead to sleeplessness?
I think I mean, it seems to be that they're kind of linked. And again, I think this is where possibly we need to be quite careful about labels. So if a teenager starts to label themselves as somebody who has sleeplessness or insomnia, then it becomes almost this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's quite a lot in the book about how you help teenagers to sleep better if they're if they're sleeping badly. So the kind of terribly named sleep hygiene and all of the practices that you put in place, keeping screens out of bedrooms. And that seems to be, even during the day, it seems to be a good idea to keep screens out of bedrooms. It can even if they're not using it, it seems to be linked to worse sleep, having screens in bedrooms, and making sure that obviously they come off screens with plenty of time before bedtime, which is really difficult because now schools are setting homework very often on Chromebooks, and then if they've got an essay that's due tomorrow morning and they're working on it at 10 p.m, then they're getting the kind of light and the adrenaline that they get through kind of the difficulty of switching off. But yes, there is obviously a link between poor mental health and having poor sleep as well. So it seems to be that having a kind of holistic approach to managing it is probably best, and trying not to make too much of a big deal about, as I said, labels.
Okay, but obviously validating their actual feelings at the time they're feeling them, but not entrenching them really in
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. As in really, I'm sorry you've had a bad sleep. This will pass. It feels really awful right now. Here are some things that we might be able to try to.
Is it helpful if you can relate to your own period when when we were teenagers and we were going through those sorts of anxieties about exams or competitions? Is that something that you can actually claw back from your own experience and reassure them that way?
I'm sure it is. I haven't read research studies saying that if you kind of go in detail through your own experience with the kind of tricky things that leads necessarily to better outcomes. But I imagine that it helps to kind of build relationships and trust, which will then help them in other ways as well, even if it's indirect.
Yeah. Even though our problems in our older generation, they're nothing like the problems that children have nowadays. Oh no.
because theirs is new and unique, and we couldn't possibly understand.
Absolutely, we're accepting that. So phones. Let's talk about phones. You mentioned screens, phone screens, all those sort of computer games as well. Now, Jonathan Haidt says that we should step away from mobile phone use by teenagers at all. And that's kind of a kind of absolutist position. Now, can you tell us what the research tells us about that? Or is it contested, that idea?
I would contest it. I think that for some teenagers, screens, smartphones, social media can be really bad. Of course, we know that. But I think the idea that there is a strong causal link between social media use and worsening teenage mental health isn't backed up by the data. So if you look at, there are big kind of studies that kind of pool information across different groups of teenagers. So you end up with data sets of thousands and thousands. So you can try and work out, pull out some of the cause and effect. You can never know for certain, but you can kind of get some more of an idea. And it does seem to be that there is a negative effect of screens and social media in particular on teenage mental health, but it's really small if you look at the data, surprisingly small. And there could be a few reasons for this. So it might be that there's no direct effect, but growing up in a culture where everything is phone based is not a particularly healthy culture to grow up in, because if you're in a room with other teenagers and people are on their phones and you can't have that kind of direct communication with them, then it affects the extent to which you can build healthy relationships. And also it's a very potentially a very comparison based culture as well. So if you've got social media, people are comparing how they look, or they're comparing their lives with other people, and inevitably coming up short because everybody always curates what they put on social media. And there's one possible explanation, which I think is a very interesting one, is that there is a relationship, but it's not a it's not a simple kind of line on a graph, that it might be more of a J-shaped relationship, which is why it doesn't show up as being very, very strong. So it may be that the teenagers who have the least phone and social media use, and those that have the most, come off very badly, but those teenagers who use it moderately actually probably come out of it quite well. So you can imagine that if a teenager is growing up in a household where screens are very restricted due to behaviour, so it might be quite an authoritarian household, quite a rules-based household, that might not be very good for them. So that might be where the kind of low use, or it may be that they're in a resource poor household, so they don't necessarily have access to it, that the access to it that other teenagers might. And that also, if you have a teenager who's on screens for kind of 8, 9, 10 hours a day, that they're going to have on average worse outcomes. But actually, if you've got teenagers who are using it to support real world relationships, they're using it to connect and build relationships with their friends online, they're using it to arrange real life meetup points, they're using it to learn new skills, they're learning Duolingo, or they're learning videography or something of that nature, that there are very positive things that I think that screens can do, that if we are just having this kind of very black and white, they are always bad conversation misses. And obviously in some cases they are, and if you have teenagers who are accessing porn, as many do, that's going to be absolutely terrible for them. If they get caught in self-harm algorithms, it's going to be absolutely awful. I know that we're going to be talking about gender identity in a bit. Some of the stuff on that is going to be really bad for them as well. But I think we need to be quite careful about not writing off all screens, and that is certainly not backed up by data.
I think that sounds like a very sensible point of view, to be honest. That if a youngster is spending too many hours on their screens, then they can't do any of the other things that they really need and want to do as well. So that seems to me to hang together. And I felt that looking at the sources you gave and looking at the arguments to and fro. I think that it's always the same, isn't it? That black and white are usually lacking in nuance.
Yeah, and there's a call by Jonathan Haidt to have this kind of cut off age 16. So teenagers don't have any social media at all until the age of 16. And I can totally see that in theory, but I think if we don't have a proper detailed balanced conversation about it, we risk potentially unforeseen consequences in other areas. So teenagers who are used to having social media might then be driven onto platforms where we have less knowledge, less control, where they end up being worse off. And also the thing that worries me slightly is the kind of cliff edge nature of the age of 16. So if you start as a 16-year-old when your brain is still developing and you've had no access, practice, support, scaffolding, and then you go into the world of social media, and you get kind of lost in it and you don't know what to do with it, you haven't had that kind of early training. What happens? We don't know. There hasn't been any research done yet.
It would be like being thrown into a pool to learn to swim, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I guess we had that when social media came online, but most of us were adults at that point, so our brains had finished developing, so it was slightly less risky potentially.
And connected with this thing about the phones, of course, is access to pornography, which you spend a considerable amount of time talking about that and how we need to discuss that, really, even though it's a really hard conversation to have. So if we don't talk to kids about porn, the porn industry will. I think
yes, and teenagers will inevitably come across porn, even if they're not accessing it themselves. They'll be sitting on a school bus when somebody else is accessing it, or they'll be at a sleepover and somebody has pulled it up, or there'll be a video that's being passed around on social media. So it's very, very unlikely they won't come across it. And at that point, you've got a model of sex and relationships that's incredibly unhealthy, and that's setting up ideas that really need countering about kind of male dominance and violence and female passivity, and we need as adults to be getting across the idea that sex in a healthy relationship is about mutual respect and desire and pleasure, and that it's not this kind of horrendous version of it that is being shown through porn. And if we don't have that conversation, then how would they know that that's not what they are then expected to do once they start having sex themselves?
Yes, and sex as well. Really talking about relationships, it kind of probably starts when they're very young, really, in a kind of outline way, obviously not detailed, but that's also a way of us to scaffold relationships to children. Now, it's more difficult, I suppose, if you're a single parent family, to do that effectively.
Yeah, well, I guess it's difficult in that you can't model it. So you can't
Yes,
show by demonstration, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. But I think you can model it in other ways. So it's not all about modeling romantic relationships. It's also about how you treat and are treated by other important adults in your life. So if you are in a single parent family, it's about the relationships that you have with your friends. It's about making sure that you're in kind of friendships in which there is mutual respect, good treatment, that you're looking out for each other, because then that it doesn't all have to be about romance. You're just showing this is kind of how humans interact with each other and support each other.
Any
And
relationships
yeah,
have to be respectful. I get that. Yeah. We've got a question here from Helen. Helen, do you want to ask your question?
Okay. Sorry, where did I put it? There we go. We've talked about mental health and the impact that phones can have. But what about sort of other things like attention spans and developing social skills in person? I suppose I'm thinking a little bit of some of the younger people that I've worked with who sort of come into the workplace and really struggle with in-person conversations and would rather do everything, on a messaging on Teams or something. And I think I seem to see with younger people that they're so used to communicating on a screen, and they really struggle with other kinds of social skills. And the point about attention spans being shorter and shorter.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the research, there is you'll be very, very unsurprised to hear that there is a strong link between amount of time spent on screens and attention span. And there have been longitudinal studies as well done on that. So they track kids across time, and those who have the most screen time at 0.1 have more symptoms of kind of attention deficits 2 years later. The researchers caution that we still can't be certain about causality, but we can probably make a fairly educated guess. So yes, attention spans, I think, are potentially an issue. And if you have social relationships, yes, although as I was saying earlier, I think they can help real world relationships in some circumstances for some teenagers. So it probably depends very much on the teenager. But if you've got somebody who isn't able to use screens healthily, who uses it for hours and hours a day, obviously it's going to stop them doing the things that we know are going to be good for them. So those social connections, or getting outside, playing sport. So yes, I agree.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Helen. Resilience. Now then, we've been leading up to this, and you do have a really good chapter on resilience, but it's woven really in a lot of what you're saying throughout the book, isn't it?
Yes. So I think it goes back slightly to what I was saying earlier about this exposure to healthy stress. So what we don't want to be doing is kind of removing every single obstacle from our teenagers' path. It's about independence and ensuring that they have plenty of opportunity to travel independently, for example, whether that's kind of going into town by themselves when they're year 7, or whether that's, I don't know, going off to a city with some friends when they're 15 together without an adult. And it's helping to reinforce messages that we believe that they have the ability to cope with tricky things. So if they know that we have faith in them to handle difficult situations, they will feel much better able to manage them for themselves. And if they have had experience of one kind of stress or difficulty, then they learn skills in how to manage that they can then apply to other other situations in future. So it's not just about learning the skills, it's also knowing they've had experience, that they've done it successfully in the past, so it's given them a model that they know that they can then do it in future. So it's almost providing them with a kind of proof point. One of the other things I talk about in the book relating to resilience is social stress related growth. So actually where you have slight kind of friction with social relationships, that can help the growth of resilience. And part of that, and this is something that I think is really important across many areas, but including resilience, is about developing an ability to consider other people's perspectives. So knowing, us included, the adults, that there is no one right way to see the world, that everything is kind of complex, it's not black and white, and if we're showing that we can take on board other people's perspectives, good arguments, that we're open to changing our minds in light of new information, then that helps teenagers to be able to do the same, and to kind of treat ideas lightly, and not believe that there is just one right way to do everything, or one right way to see the world. Alison, I think you're on mute.
I beg your pardon. You suggest ways of doing that with the youngsters, so that they can look at it from other people's point of view. So you put them in the position of watching somebody else with their problem. What would you say to them about it?
Yes. So if it's a friendship difficulty, for example, it's not coming in with a solution, but saying, what do you think you might want to do about it, or yes, how might you advise a friend if it was happening to them? Yeah. If they ask you what you would do, then obviously you don't need to kind of hold back, but generally they will prefer, and I'm really bad at doing this, and I've really had to train myself not to, but parents who don't rush in with solutions to every problem, but actually you're just there as a kind of sounding board. And if they feel as though they can kind of create the solution themselves, it bolsters their self-esteem, because they know that they can handle problems for themselves, as well as giving kind of models for how to do it in future as well.
Yeah, and if they can model that on their clubs and activities, so they can be giving advice to youngsters who've just started as to how they felt when they just started. That's another way they can get self-esteem from that too, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually there is this set of studies, I haven't talked about them in the book because there was obviously limited space, but there's a really interesting series of studies done on developing a sense of belonging by an American scholar by Walton, and he's mostly looked at university age, but he's also replicated some of the findings at school level as well. And it's about creating an idea that not everybody, that it's normal to feel that you don't belong at the start of university in particular, but you can then kind of model that back to school, and that feelings of belonging increase in time, and you can do that by it through a really incredibly short intervention where you have case studies. So you have the older kids who are saying, like little video vignettes or in-person ones, where they're saying, actually, I really struggled with this. I kind of felt as though I didn't have the right skills, and I didn't have the right accent, and I didn't have this when I arrived. And actually, after a few months, I'd kind of found my tribe, or I'd settled into my coursework, or whatever it might be. And by imparting those kind of twin messages, it helps other teenagers to believe that they can feel that sense of belonging as well, and then that helps them with other outcomes. So actually, at the university level, in the university studies, they became less likely to drop out after a year, and they became more likely to pass the course successfully, because they developed when they didn't feel as though they belonged right at the start of the process, they didn't worry about it, and they were then more able to kind of wrap in that sense of belonging as they went through. And sense of belonging is so important to well-being. Yeah.
And if you can look back to when you started at junior school and kindergarten, junior school, secondary school, then you can see that that's going to happen for you when you get into university, if you just give it a little while. but you
Yes,
might
but
need some
again, not for
professional
everyone.
help.
So you don't want to
No,
be
no.
imparting that message when with kids who've really struggled at school. Probably at that point, you're going to be saying, actually, it will get better. And once you're an adult, you're much more
Yes,
likely to
yes.
be able to find other people who are similar to you. But yes, for those who've had a kind of successful time at school, then absolutely.
Yeah, and then so when the children go up to the secondary school for a day to see what it's going to be like in the next term, then they have prefects explaining how they felt the same way. I mean, I can see how that's modelled throughout childhood. And Walton, did you say? This sounds
Yes.
like a great intervention. I'd love to read more about that.
Yeah, and it's been replicated across several different studies and done with thousands of students as well. So it seems to be quite robust.
Great. That's really excellent. Can I come on to gender, because you've done quite a lot about gender, and I think in the references that we'll be putting in the chat at various points, you've got 3 papers that you did, I think, for Sex Matters about gender
Yes.
questioning children, but you deal with this brilliantly here, and you paint a picture of a 12-year-old Nellie stroke Noah character who's navigating gender questioning feelings. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this issue about gender and how important it is?
Yeah, so I don't know anything about kind of prior levels of knowledge, so I'm assuming that I should assume no prior knowledge. Is that right? Or some?
Some people will know a bit, and I know somebody's got a question for you later, so we'll come back to that.
Okay. So this is the idea that you might have an identity that doesn't necessarily align with your sex. So if you are a teenager, you're a boy or a girl, then you might believe that you are actually the opposite sex, or you might have an identity that's non-binary or something of that nature. And there's been so the number of gender questioning teenagers has absolutely rocketed kind of since about 2010. So I think there was a 1,600% increase over about 12 years from 2010 in the proportion in the numbers who were referred to the former Gender Identity Development Service. And if you are somebody who takes a view on this issue that is not mine, you might say, well, that is a reflection of society becoming more comfortable with people who have a trans identity. So therefore, the explosion in numbers reflects that. Or it might be that from my own perspective and the research I've done, I think it's much more likely to be this, that if you have a society where it's very normalized that people have a gender identity that is different from their sex, that it then becomes something to which a kind of developing mind, particularly one that has undergone stress and difficulty, can attach itself and kind of hook on. And if you look at the research on who is most likely to develop gender distress among teenagers, it's something like 8 times the proportion of kids who've been in care. Most of them are likely to have underlying mental health conditions. There's also an 8 times higher prevalence of kids who are on the autistic spectrum or who have other neurodevelopmental conditions. There's a higher proportion of kids that previously experienced physical or sexual abuse. So I think there is really significant vulnerability among this cohort. And what we think, although we don't know for certain because the research is quite limited, but what we think is probably true is that affirming teenagers in a trans identity is more likely to make that identity persist and less likely to enable them to become comfortable with their physical bodies over the longer term, because there were quite a lot of studies done with younger children in the 1980s and 1990s, and the vast majority of them desisted from a trans identity. They weren't socially affirmed, and then they desisted from that identity by the time they reached adulthood. We don't really have that data on teenagers because it's such a recent phenomenon, and we haven't properly collected good data, but it seems quite likely that if you are affirmed in an identity, then it becomes a lot harder then to say, actually, I've changed my mind. Or as I was saying earlier when I was talking about mental health labels, if you have a label, you wrap it into your sense of identity, it becomes much harder to shake it off. So the kind of conclusion being, we have to be very careful about social transition. We have to be quite careful about the messages that are coming through from schools and in books, that this is just another kind of, it's just a state of being rather than a signal that actually there might be vulnerabilities that teenagers need additional support with. And then if you look at the kind of physical transition, there was the CAS review last year has kind of pretty much brought a halt to puberty blockers being prescribed to teenagers, at least in England. But there still seems to be prescription that some people are able to access through private services, and also there hasn't yet been a kind of proper crackdown on cross-sex hormones. So if you're a teenager who kind of goes down the physical transition pathway, then you would receive puberty blockers that prevent you going through your physical puberty, and then you would move on to something called cross-sex hormones, which is where you get so if you are a boy, a natal boy, you would get given estrogen, and if you were a girl, you get given testosterone. And if you've gone straight from puberty blockers through to cross-sex hormones, there's all sorts of long-term physical health effects, many of which are irreversible. So irreversible physical changes, but also side effects as well. So impacts on bone density. Girls can suffer from vaginal atrophy. There are kind of seem to be long-term heart conditions and all sorts of impacts. So, for example, if you've never been through puberty, you will almost certainly be infertile. You'll probably never have an orgasm. So the kids that go on this kind of medical pathway, decisions are being made that have enormous impact on their long-term outcomes, and to which they haven't, I don't believe, got the capacity to consent, because they can't understand what that means when they are 12, 13, 14. They've got no idea what it means to be infertile or not to have a healthy sex life as an adult or anything of that nature. So and I think if digging down into the research studies, there's a lot that's been kind of misreported on mental health and suicidality. And if you actually look at what it says, there's very little evidence to back it up.
And that really is shocking, isn't it? Dr. Cass said that social transition is not a neutral act. I think it's really important that schools get to understand this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she was a lot clearer on that for younger children, but so kind of primary age, but I think it's still a massive issue for teenagers as well.
Now you talk about Nellie, and you talk wanted to be Noah, and you talk about the risks that are involved in this in your book in pages 129, 136. So crystal clear. You've boiled it down to a really good explanation. I recommend that chapter for parents and people concerned about this. But also, while we're on this subject, you've produced these packs for looking at gender in teens and for sex matters. Do you want to talk? And you reference them actually helpfully in the back of the book. Do you want to talk about those as well a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So they were actually the research that I did to inform that chapter, and because there was so much of it, and because there wasn't very much available for parents at that time, Sex Matters very kindly agreed to put them out as a series of much longer papers that could then inform my book chapter later on. So there are 3 different papers, and the first one looks at reasons that teenagers might start to question their gender. So looking at some of the underlying vulnerabilities that I was talking about, looking at some of the social context, the internet, some kind of early evidence about possible social contagion. Then the second paper looks at treatment and outcomes. So it looks at what we know about the medical pathway and what we don't know about it. It looks at what we know about psychotherapy. It looks at what we know about desistance and detransition. So desistance is when sometimes still as teenagers, sometimes as adults, people who've had a trans identity then lose it, and detransition is where there's been some level of medical intervention and they desist from a trans identity, but there is also quite often a level of kind of medical complication and ongoing necessary treatment that is there. And actually there are very few medical professionals that are equipped yet to be able to support detransitioners. So I hope that that might be changing as people develop more understanding about how best to support them. And then the final paper is based on a series of interviews with experts in this area. So psychotherapists, parent support groups, and others who really understand kind of how parents can support teenagers who have gender distress, how they can have conversations with them, how they can kind of navigate really tricky conversations so that other perspectives can be aired, but not in a way that turns anything into a battleground, because that can then kind of really create the conditions in which an idea set can start to crystallize, how you keep perspectives open, how you support some of the kind of underlying vulnerabilities or other factors that might be underlying a trans identity. So yes, those are the three.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good explanation, really, of your papers. And I think you wrote one of them with Stella O'Malley, who's
yes.
And you refer to her book about what to do when your child says that they're trans.
Yes,
which is a really good book.
She wrote with two other psychotherapists, Lisa Marciano and Sasha Ayad, and that's a very helpful book for anyone with a gender questioning teenager.
And you refer to that in the endnotes as well. Yeah. Now, one of our viewers, I'm not going to say a name, but is not able to ask this themselves. But I'd welcome guidance on gender, especially when standing against a school that unquestionably goes along with it. I'll give you a minute to think about that, but I'd say have a look at Safe Schools Alliance, because they've done a lot of work with schools and they've got templates of letters to write to your schools and got lots of successful experience of parents working along those lines, having conversations with teachers, the head teachers and all governors. So that may be something. Look at Safe Schools Alliance website.
Yeah, and there's also Sex Matters has got some resources. Transgender Trend, Bayswater Support Group would be other ones to try. And I think there's also making reference to CAS. The CAS review is something that parents can do now that it wasn't previously within their power, because there wasn't anything with that kind of level of influence at a policy level. And there's also the Keeping Children Safe in Education policy that's been put out by the Department for Education, which is worth referencing because quite often schools' policies won't align with that. And the Keeping Children Safe in Education policy makes reference to the gender questioning children policy that was put out by the previous government, and it hasn't yet been turned into official policy, but it's there as is a kind of holding place until such time as the Department for Education updates its guidance. And because that's referenced within a kind of statutory area, you can then say, actually, these are the areas in which the school may be putting itself at potential legal risk or just kind of not aligning with what is accepted policy and good practice in this area.
Yeah, no, I think all of those are really good suggestions. If you want more information, or if you can't follow up on what we've been saying, ask her, then by all means email us at info@liberalvoiceforwomen.org, and we'll give you some more avenues to go down. But I think Matilda's given us some really great ways of starting looking at these things. Certainly Transgender Trend and the Bayswater Group are very supportive organisations that will give you lots of help. Maybe we'll come back to that. Somebody else is also asking me to ask this to you, Matilda. Is there no significant pushback on the sexism of gender identity ideology?
Seemingly not. I mean, obviously, among those of us who are kind of talking about this, then yes, absolutely. But it doesn't. It's one message that I get constantly surprised by when it hasn't kind of filtered down to schools and healthcare professionals and other people that have a clear influence over particular local circumstances, counsellors and others. And actually, I think once you understand that it can be about regressive stereotypes if you divorce whether you are male or female from your physical body and physical sense of reality, then what else does it mean to be a man or a woman or a girl or a boy? And at that point you can only really fall back on stereotypes, and you hear this kind of replicated again and again in case studies and stories. So this boy didn't like wearing dresses, or sorry, did like wearing dresses, or the girl didn't like the girl wanted to play football and wanted to play with the boys, and at that point then gender identity becomes something that we've been trying to escape from for the last kind of 70, 80, 90, 100 years. And actually there are all sorts of ways of being male, female, being a man, woman, girl or a boy, and you can kind of present in any way you like. You can wear what you like effectively. You can have whatever interests you like, and that's not a signifier of being male or female, but actually your physical body is the only thing really that influences that. Otherwise all we're left with is stereotypes. And if you look at the certainly for younger children, the diagnosis in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the diagnosis for gender dysphoria is almost entirely based on stereotypes. So about kind of rejecting play that's typically associated with their sex, for example, is one of the things. And by the time you've ticked 5 of those mostly stereotype related boxes, you can get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
I wonder if that that's good really good for us to be going on with, because as far as I'm concerned, they all seem tremendously regressive. More regressive than even it was when I was growing up, way back. and all these regressive stereotypes are absolute. It's kind of catnip to me.
Yeah, but at the same time, you can understand when that's the way it's presented, you can totally understand why teenagers would start to think, well, that doesn't represent me. So if you've got these, if being a girl is about having kind of long hair and loads of makeup and long nails and not playing sport, and you are a girl that doesn't fit into that, then what are you, if that is the only thing culturally that you're allowed to be? And then at that point you almost it becomes an incentive to opt out of it if you don't feel entirely comfortable with it.
Yes, I think that's not unreasonable, and I think that's something that little children, they don't have this awareness, do they? That they think that a man is always like this and a woman is always like that, and anybody who looks like a woman is a woman. and gradually, as the child development takes place, you can see them growing in awareness that there are differences of behaviour and expression, naturally speaking, which it seems as though some of the gender ideationists, is that right? Is that a word? Haven't got past that level of development. I'm just imagining that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult, because I think if you are somebody who believes that everybody has this innate sense of who you are, then perhaps you haven't got to the point where you are starting to think about it in those terms, because why would you ever think about it like that if you think that everybody has an innate, immutable, eternal sense of gender? What surprises me is in 2025, if you haven't got to the point where you might be curious about the fact that lots of people have a different perspective on it and then started to think, well, what is it that they think that I don't think? That's the thing that really surprises me now, rather than that kind of ability to think abstractly about it.
Yes. Oh, well, look, thank you. That's a really good look at this. Now, I can't recommend this book too highly. And I really, every page there's something really great on. My note that I put at the end of the book is, Doc needs more attention.
Yeah, poor old dog doesn't get enough. He gets plenty of walks. He may not get enough walks from my teenagers.
that's not really summing up the book nearly well enough. But there's lots of great reviews on Amazon from readers who've already looked at it and taken it in. So please do, people, have a look at it, and we may come back to this again in future sessions. Now, I'd like to look at one of your reports that you produced, Women's Services, a Sector Silenced. And this report looks at how gender identity beliefs affect the women's sector. And you looked at you did interviews with leaders of the sector, the sustainability of the organisations, and how gender ideology compromises their ability to offer single-sex services and spaces to or for rape and domestic violence survivors, and for women in prison. I was delighted to see in your forewords a quote from one of our gender critical councillors group, Councillor Thalia Marrington, as well as Labour, Conservative and Independent women MPs. Really great to see that. She's usually here, but I don't know whether she's here tonight or whether she's in a meeting. What I'd like to ask you, how do we encourage the women's sector to roll back the inclusion of trans-identifying males and stop the self-exclusion of the terribly vulnerable females?
So in order to answer that, I think it's probably worth just highlighting one or two of the findings from the report, because I think it will help to set up what the nature of the challenge is. So leaders reported that where you've got so-called inclusive services, that's services where women are women by self-identification as opposed to by sex. So effectively it includes men who identify as women. So at that point it becomes a mixed sex service. And the irony is that that's presented as being an inclusive service, but it ends up being exclusive, because you end up with women who self-exclude from the services or who aren't able to use it to the degree to which they need support, because almost all of them have been subject previously to male violence. So even if you look at female prisoners, the vast majority of them have experience of sexual abuse or have other experiences of violence in their histories. And at that point, if you have males in a service and you have somebody who is trying to get over the trauma of having experience male violence, then either they're going to be using the service to a point which is not sufficient then to be able to get the help and support they need. So they might be sitting in a kind of support group but not feel that they're able to speak openly or feel very uncomfortable, or for many of them, according to the leaders that I spoke with, they just won't come. So you end up with these incredibly vulnerable women who have complex support needs, who don't then get the help and support that they need because of this kind of so-called inclusive service. One of the problems, so that it's a massive challenge for women's sector leaders, because it's been incredibly hard for them to offer services that are truly single sex, because there's been such a degree of kind of pushback, and also a lot of the time it's determined by local authorities or other commissioners of services who will make funding contingent upon it being inclusive of trans-identifying males, as well as obviously of women. And at that point, the leaders have a choice. The ones who want to offer single-sex services have a choice between either not providing the services that would really help the women that they've been designed for, or of losing funding, which is obviously a kind of absolutely impossible choice. I think there are also a number of leaders who don't feel as though they are able to offer single-sex services because there's there's a slight fuzziness over the definition of sex in the Equality Act. And there's something within the Equality Act, you have exceptions that allow service providers to offer single-sex services. But because sex hasn't been properly defined, some people interpret that as being legal sex as opposed to natal sex. And legal sex can be anyone that holds a gender recognition certificate. And because there is a kind of separate guidance or kind of the common belief that you can't then ask people for their gender recognition certificates, because, and actually I think you can, the kind of the confusion is you're not meant to make somebody else's GRC available to anyone else, but you can actually ask to see it. And I caveat that by saying I'm not a lawyer, so please don't rely on
but
me
Michael
for
Foran says you can ask.
any legal advice. But so the issue with this then is because it's quite confusing, and there are single sex exceptions that service providers can use, but some of them have been told they can only do that on a case-by-case basis. They can't blanket say this is a single sex service, and it's kind of it seems to be that you can, but a lot of people believe that you can't, and that actually having a clarification of sex in the Equality Act would be very helpful, because it would give service providers the confidence to be able to offer single sex services, and also potentially give commissioners greater power then to, or kind of to convince commissioners that they don't have to make funding open to anyone who wants to access the service, that actually they can say this is meeting a particular need of women to have single sex support. So I think that clarification is potentially one area. There's it may come possibly through another direction. So there's a court case at the moment, so that waiting for judgment to be passed. The Supreme Court has heard a case, a Scottish case, and it's the Scottish ministers, for Women Scotland versus Scottish ministers. And what For Women Scotland are appealing is the idea that sex in the Equality Act means legal sex, not biological sex. So they're trying to get the definition clarified to mean biological sex, and that ruling is expected kind of
imminently.
Imminently. And at that point, if the Supreme Court finds in favour of For Women Scotland, I think that will instantly make things a lot more straightforward for the sector and for others that have an interest in single sex service provision. And there's also potentially some kind of stuff around the edges, like that it appears to be, from the research that I've done in this area, but also others as well, there's a huge role for training. So there appears to be massive amounts of incorrect training that is giving people incorrect information about the Equality Act and about case law and about ability to provide single sex services lawfully. You've got trainers who are offering training on the so-called protected characteristic of gender. There is no such thing. You have either the protected characteristic of sex or the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And actually kind of going at source, I think, with some of this training provision and ensuring that it's high quality and lawful would really, or that the advice that it gives is lawful, would really help as well. And I think the other thing is just being able to talk about these issues in the open, because that's been something that leaders in the sector haven't been able to do, because they've been absolutely vilified in the past when they have, and that's that the culture is changing rapidly. And actually everybody is able to have open conversations more comfortably, I think, than they used to. And with the court case with Thandi Peggy that's happening at the moment, and others, that conversation is happening in the media as well, so that may open things up to greater ability to provide single-sex services in future, if you can just kind of bring oxygen and air to some of these issues.
Yeah, light is the best disinfectant, isn't it? And
Yeah.
that's a fabulous awareness raising or outline of the situation where we are at the moment. And in your interviews, actually, some people do give named accounts. So Karen Ingala Smith, who is a former guest on our Zooms here, and she's written Defending Women's Spaces, of course. She talked about NIA, of which she was a chief executive, and I think also Aurora New Dawn, Dr. Shona Dillon.
Yeah, so I did 3 interviews with people who were experts. So they not only had kind of run services or had other involvement, but they had also done, like in the case of both Karen and Shona, they'd done academic research, they'd done interviews of their own with others. So I was interviewing them in their roles, but also as experts. And then everybody else was given anonymity to enable them to speak openly in a way that they might not have been able to do otherwise.
Yeah. That's a really good way of looking at it. And I think Jess Phillips also gave a named quote as well.
Yes.
And she's been involved before Parliament in that field too. So some people are feeling more able to speak up and speak out on behalf of the women, the workers who
so I did that research, that it was done about 18 months ago, and it was published in January last year. So obviously the situation has changed a huge amount since then, and I'm seeing the nature of the debate and the environment change. So I couldn't say for certain whether women's sector leaders would feel similarly, but I hope that the fact that there is more chat about this issue in the media, online, that there's kind of national polling that suggests that the majority of people in increasing numbers support single-sex services, that all of these will create an environment that makes it easier for leaders to make decisions that align with what they believe their service users need,
and follow the evidence that you're being able to amass. Yeah. Another question, if I can ask, as well as being inclusive of males, we've got another issue about including trans-identified females, trans men, who also may well need to have access to what are women's services, but of course with kind of conflict internally there. But how do we include them without re-traumatizing the other women, as you say, who've had domestic violence aimed at them and would be re-traumatized by contact with somebody who looks maybe a bit like a man?
It was interesting. So I remember one of my interviewees was talking, it was a kind of be careful what you wish for moment in terms of clarifying the meaning of the word sex in the Equality Act, because if you have service provision that is entirely by sex, then you need to include women who identify as men who may have been on testosterone for years and have very, very physically male looking presentation,
yes.
beard growth, muscles, all kind of body fat redistribution, all the rest of it, which can obviously, if you are a woman who has been subject to male violence, then that could be incredibly difficult. And her point was that if you clarify the meaning of sex without recognizing that you might need to do some kind of nuanced thinking around the edges or provision that allows for exceptions to be made, that you might end up in a situation where, as you say, women end up, very vulnerable women end up getting re-traumatized, self-excluding, all of the issues that we've spoken about already. And actually what I think it goes back to is what the women's sector has always done in the past. So there were a few different interviewees who were saying, actually, in the past, we managed these issues. We came across trans-identifying men, trans-identifying women. We dealt with these situations on a case-by-case scenario as they came up before it became such a politically toxic issue. They just were able to manage it through making sensible, pragmatic decisions. So they might refer people onto a specialist LGBT service, or they might offer one-to-one support for a kind of a male looking woman who might otherwise make things difficult in a group situation. So there are different kind of sensible, kind ways of managing it where everybody gets the support they need, and women's sector leaders have the expertise and knowledge to be able to do that. It's just been a very politically difficult time for them to be able to make those decisions over recent years.
Yeah, and with certain political decisions, it has been inimical, really, to the exercise of their skill and judgment, hasn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Well, that's a really great question, and a really great answer, I should say. I think we might just have time. Have we got a few minutes to talk about your flying flags and ticking boxes report? Because that's one that, as I said before, you and Simon Fanshawe did. I think you did lots of interviews with really quite high-powered people, didn't you, in business and agencies? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this was looking at equality, diversity and inclusion in organisations, and I interviewed 45 people from across the public and private sectors, mostly in leadership positions, so either chief executives or people that ran either HR or EDI functions, and then some staff network leads as well. And we wanted to explore what's happening with EDI in organisations at the moment, where it's going well, where it needs strengthening, what organisations need to be kind of wary of, and perhaps where it needs to go looking forward. And I think what we found was that not all the time by any means, but in some cases, well-intentioned EDI policies that are designed to be inclusive, going back to that inclusion word again, end up actually being divisive. So they end up creating problems when they've been set out to do something very, very different, and that actually pitting people against each other by separating them into identity groups, whether that's through kind of staff networks or other ways of cutting it, if it's not managed quite carefully, can make people feel in competition with each other, or it can make other groups feel excluded, and then you can almost make the impacts worse because people start to feel alienated from the others around them, and then they end up behaving in a way, they treat people worse than they would have done if they all were kind of feeling collegiate and part of a wider team. So it's about kind of articulating a common purpose and a common vision, and really bringing people together rather than separating them out into groups, and moving beyond the kind of performative EDI activities, so days of celebration or flags or whatever it may be, that just kind of touch things on a surface level and maybe alienate some, to deeper kind of actual real change that actually makes a difference to people within the organisation who might otherwise experience discrimination or harassment, and kind of creating policies that allow diversity of thought within organisations. So it's not just this kind of one unipolar view that then means that you don't know how to manage crises and catastrophes when they come, because you don't have any other way of seeing the issue.
And this is something that obviously in business there are always crises and catastrophes, and also sadly in the public sector as well. And if we're supposed to be working together towards a common purpose, whether it's simply profit motive, which has its place, or a public good, then to what extent do these methods of separating people out work against what you're trying to accomplish?
Quite significantly, according to what we were told. And actually looking at, after doing the research, I was looking at some of the kind of academic pieces that might inform some of our findings as well. So I didn't want to have a kind of clear sense before doing the interviews of what the academic literature says, but looking at it because it might then inform the questions that I was asking, and kind of predetermine some of the findings. But actually looking at some of it afterwards and trying to find if there's a backup. It does seem to be that experimental research where you separate people into identity groups creates more unhappiness and divisions, and pits people against each other in a way that finding that kind of common thread and common narrative doesn't. So there does seem to be kind of proper, it's not just a bunch of senior leaders' opinions. There is actually some kind
Psychology
of heft behind what they were saying.
Yeah, excellent. Now then, oh yes, there we are. Equality, diversity and inclusion work appears to have become disconnected from its fundamental purpose. That's a really good quotation in the report that sort of hit me. I think you've answered my next question, which was going to be about how could the staffers and HR people address the real diversity needs and of the staff and end users. You've given us that. What flavour, rather, I'll ask you this, what flavour did you get from your interviewees about their enthusiasm or reluctance about developing genuine diversity mechanisms?
I think there was some who thought everything's working pretty well, but they were probably in the minority. So they were kind of showcasing the practice within their own organisations. But I think a lot of interviewees recognised that there was something more fundamental that isn't working at the moment when it comes to EDI, and it's wider. It's not just about the kind of common purpose and being careful about identity groupings. There's also things like creating a culture where it's okay to disagree. So you actually deliberately set out to let people kind of thrash through issues and kind of set a culture where you don't just have everyone falling into line behind the opinion of a leader, that you have this kind of productive disagreement. So it's not just that everyone's fighting with each other all the time, but actually it's done in a kind of constructive way where you're trying to problem solve and you're throwing in different perspectives and ideas and really working it through. And part of it's about data and evidence as well. So it seems to be that there's very little measurement of what works at the moment when it comes to EDI, which then limits the extent to which leaders can make good decisions, because if they don't understand what works within their own organisations as well as more broadly, then they can't kind of refine their policies and what they're doing to make sure that it's working better in future. And I think there was definite recognition from leaders, and I think possibly HR slightly more than EDI, that actually there needs to be a bit more of a rethink. But even within EDI teams as well, there were some who were saying actually we really need to grapple with this, because at the moment, if you have, for example, if you have a kind of a list of characteristics that you're recruiting for, so you have targets relating to the number of women or the number of ethnic minority individuals who are appointed to a board or something of that nature, then you risk perceptions of tokenism, and within the individuals who are appointed, it can also really erode confidence and self-esteem if they think that they've been appointed on that basis. Whereas if you make it about reducing barriers and removing discrimination where it exists, but you make the appointment decisions about merit, then you remove the risk that people start to feel excluded or have this kind of belief that there is a tokenism happening that can then kind of undermine the culture and goodwill.
Yes, I can see that. For instance, if you're doing an audition, a blind audition for orchestra, that makes sure that the candidates you listen to, you're able to hear how they play without noticing, without seeing. Yeah. Can you mute yourself, please? I think that's Jeannie.
Oh yeah. Sorry, on mute. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, if you're doing a blind audition, then you're able to make judgments without having to have a look at these other factors which may be exclusive.
Yeah, although it's very hard to replicate the orchestral blind audition in most organisations, unfortunately.
Sadly so. Una Jane has got a question right from the beginning. We're going right back to 7:15, just before we finish. Una Jane, would you like to ask about the neglectful parenting? Are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still with you. Well, my history of persecution by an obviously very damaged man means that I look back to his childhood as he gave me just a few details, and I wondered if this was neglectful parenting. He told me that his parents got divorced, and then that his mother was very badly treated by her soon-to-be ex-husband, and then he happened to be an only child. So the neglectful parenting seems very a possibility.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I've got no idea in terms of individual examples because I know nothing about the history, so I couldn't say. But I mean, yeah, what I can say is that neglectful parenting leads to some pretty disastrous long-term outcomes, definitely.
And there are evidences that you give in the book of some of these reports that you quoted us. Yeah. Thank you. Look, I think you've given us a real insight into your research methods as well, and the outputs that you've had, and it's a matter for some hope amongst us that maybe for Women in Scotland's judgment that's coming up, or maybe the current judgment in that we're awaiting from the Fife case that we're listening to avidly this week, will make a difference. But certainly it seems, as you say, that discussion has opened up in the media. Scottish Daily Express has been using correct sex pronouns with one of the respondents to this case this last week, and that's made a big difference. So a lot of the research that you're doing, with whether it's to do with teenagers or with gender ideation, has been absolutely really interesting and really useful. And I look forward to hearing a lot more from you as we go along. I don't think anybody else has got any more questions, but by all means, people do write in. If you want to ask a question, you can subscribe to Matilda's Substack. Is that right?
Yes.
And there's a PDF which people can get with frequently asked questions, I believe. And I think the Substack is matildagosling.substack.com, and it's a really interesting looking one. You're on LinkedIn.
I am.
And you're at Matilda Gosling on X and Blue Sky. And you have your own website which has all the references to these resources we've been talking about tonight. But I would say definitely go to see Teenagers and the evidence-based parenting book for toddlers, from toddlers to preteens. And the reports are diversitybydesign.co.uk, and it's called Flying Flags and Ticking Boxes. It's a really good report. And the one that you did about women's services and sector silenced, that can be seen at sexmatters.org. And it is called that, Women's Services and Sector Silence. There's the full report and also a summary. And there are 3 parts to your survey of teenagers and gender identity, and they are all on the Sex Matters website.
And all of those reports are linked on my website as well, if that's easier to remember than going
fantastic.
to
Go to matildagosling.com website and you'll find routes to them there. We have put them in the chat, so you can scrape them off the chat or send yourself a link to them after this. And there are also actually 2 really good YouTubes that Sex Matters did about detransitioners, which you talked about some detransitioners and desisters when you talk about gender. And there are some quite heartrending case studies there about detransitioners. And another seminar I think Sex Matters did on teenagers and gender distress, with you and Stella speaking on the same YouTube. So those are both worth going to the Sex Matters channel there. The final thing, which sadly we haven't had time to talk about tonight, is the work you've done for the Lesbian Project. And that is research that you did. The research overview is by you and Diane Stoyanov on demography, public life, family and relationships, the workplace, safety and health, all downloadable from the lesbianproject.co.uk/resources. So that's a quick look at the various resources we've been talking about tonight. I would like to thank you so much, Matilda, for coming on here and spending so much of your pretty valuable time talking to us here. It's been an absolutely wonderful opportunity for us. I'd like to thank Rachel for managing the event for Liberal Voice Women. We aim to put the talk up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible, but it does take time. Thank you all for your great questions and comments. We'll meet next on Monday, the 10th of March, when in fact our guest will be Ros Adams, whose employment tribunal against Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre early last year was a remarkable expose of a service out of control and, I would say, over-inclusive. So do look out for the announcement or sign up to our website, liberalvoicewomen.org, and we'll send you the invitation as soon as it comes out. We also want to hear from you with any policy-related issues or problems that you want us to raise politically. Thank you again so much, Matilda, and we'll let you get on with the rest of your family life now. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been a joy. Cheers. Bye-bye.